Good morning, everyone. It's a real pleasure to actually be in the room with you and to be in the room with you too, online. And also to be in the room with those who may be looking at this sometime down the road. I've been spending a lot more time in the country lately, so I really appreciate these encounters with people, just to be with others. And this morning, as I was on the subway coming here, there was just this wonderful moment of everyone in their own position in that subway car, just all, manifesting the Dharma in whatever position they had. And it seemed apropos to me to what I wanted to talk about here today. My name is Yugetsu. I'm a senior student here. And through sheer luck of survival, I'm one of the people who was around in the early days when the Zendo was in the apartment of our co-founders, Roshi Enkyo and Roshi Joshin. And I have to say, being an old-timer, that one of the things that continues to impress me so much about this place is its collaborative nature. It's an endeavor where, and it's always changing. The collaborations are always kind of shifting, some of them quite quickly, some of them over time. But there are people who coordinate the online Zendo. There are people who open in the morning. There are people who clean the place and organize zazen. We have our groups, the People of Color Sitting Group, the Bolivian Sangha, Grace and Grit, sorting out our stuff, and many others. I'm probably missing ones, but they are on the calendar on our website. And they're all vital expressions of the Village Zendo. And I'm part of a very small working group, the Zen Women Pioneers website project, and I wanted to talk a little bit about that today. It's a project that highlights under-documented women pioneers in Zen. And because we wanted to start at home developing our pilot, our first subject is Enkyo Roshi. So as part of this, creating the first of what we hope will be other portraits of Zen women pioneers, we interviewed Roshi. And I spent a lot of time editing this interview, so it's very much fresh right now in my mind. And it's really influenced what I wanted to say today. Namely, I wanted to talk about how the Village Zendo came to be known by our temple name as Dotoku-ji, in honor of Dogen's fascicle, Dotoku, or true expression. And how Zen Buddhism came to the West in the true expression of Ruth Fuller Sasaki. Now, the Village Zendo came about in a very intimate and personal way, and Roshi describes it this way in her interview. It's kind of funny because the Village Zendo is about opening our arms and serving people and having a practice place for people. But it started off as a very selfish thing. And I found that my own personal practice really required some discipline that I didn't have. So I would prepare to sit and then suddenly find myself walking down the street going for a coffee or something. And I thought, wow, if I invite people to my house to sit with me, then I will sit. And I think that's still the principle here, as we invite people so we all can sit. It's not like that there's some superior that's beckoning people, but it's a community, and that's how it got started. And in that beginning, when Enkyo and Joshin invited people to sit with them in their Greenwich Village apartment, it began as, it's always been an intimate space, but this was particularly intimate. I remember zazenkais where the tea room was their bedroom, and we sat observing formal silence, having tea, sitting on their bed, and listening to the noisy NYU streets below. And people came, and suddenly the shoes that were lined up across the wall in the hallway started to spill into the building, the apartment building hallway, and they weren't too happy about that. And we had outgrown the space, and it was time to move. And we moved into several different places, and here's where we find ourselves today. And because we had grown, the white plum lineage, the Soto Zen official group, reached out to Roshi and said, well, what's your official temple name? And so that's when Roshi came up with the name Dotokuji. And it's based on Dogen's Dotoku, true expression. And so here's what Roshi says in the interview about why she looked around and came up with that name. She saw the Sangha and said, they're singers, they're filmmakers, they're writers, they're painters, or they're people that express themselves through the service that they do in the world. So that just came to me as the most appropriate description of the Sangha. They're all expressors, and this is the temple of true expression. And since it is so based on Dogen's Dotoku, I wanted to take a little bit of a look here at the fascicle that inspired our name. It's chapter 40 of the Shobogenzo, which is this mammoth, wonderful work by Dogen. But in this particular fascicle, Dogen begins, and he usually has most of the meat right in the beginning, right? He begins with saying, all Buddhas and ancestors are expressions. Thus, when Buddha ancestors intend to select Buddha ancestors, they always ask, do you have your expression? So, who are these Buddha ancestors that he's referring to? Because Buddha ancestors are kind of, they have a particular place in Zen practice. They're not bodhisattvas or Buddhas or enlightened beings. They're ordinary human beings. They're imperfect. They have their flaws, and they have their quirks and their problems. And they're very much like us. And they approach each other with this question: do you have your expression? What's your expression? Dogen says, this question is asked with the mind and body. It's asked with a walking stick or a whisk. It's asked with a pillar or a lantern. Now, if you've been in this space, you know there's this huge pillar right in the middle of the Village Zendo. And Roshi gave a really great talk just on the expression of this pillar in this Zendo. because we're always in conversation with it in one way or another. So Dogen continues. Such an expression is not obtained by following others or by the power of oneself, not coming from out there, and it's not totally coming from you. Where there is a thorough inquiry of a Buddha ancestor, there is an expression of a Buddha ancestor. So as he often does, Dogen is encouraging us to go deeper, to investigate, to make thorough inquiries of our Buddha ancestors. And these expressions of these intimate encounters are manifestations of Buddha Dharma. There's something bigger. They're always done in collaboration, but they're not done in a vacuum, you know. They're Buddha Dharma. They're infinitely subtle and mysterious. And, you know, we are here expressing the Dharma, whether we're teachers or lay people, whether we've been practicing here for many years, or whether we just walked in the door today and are just checking the place out. We're all in our positions. So in our project on Zen women pioneers, we asked our Buddha ancestor, Roshi Enkyo, which of the Zen women ancestors most inspired her, most influenced her. And she responded, when somebody asks me, well, what teacher had the most effect on you? I don't think back to classical Chinese times, or I don't think back to India. You know who I think of? Ruth Fuller Sasaki from the 1930s. And so I think that's who I think of. I don't think of early nuns in China or somewhere, and they were wonderful, and I have read all those things. But for inspiration, give me Ruth Fuller Sasaki. Now, I was taken by surprise by her ancestor because I was fully, you know, expecting rice cake woman or something like that to come out of her mouth. But I'd never heard of Ruth Fuller Sasaki. And I have to say, this kind of bothered me because, you know, here at the Village Zendo, we spent a good bit of time in researching our female Zen lineage, and we've updated the list and we chanted at services. And we're also familiar with many of the men who brought Zen to the West, D.T. Suzuki, Shunryu Suzuki, Alan Watts, Gary Snyder. These are names maybe you're familiar with because they're known as pioneers in bringing Zen to the West. But I'd never heard of Ruth Fuller Sasaki. And so I set off on this path of getting to know her and wanting to learn more about her. And I wanted to share some of that with you in case maybe you too are in that position of never hearing of Ruth Fuller Sasaki. And I'll begin by using her own words to introduce herself. In one of her books, Zen, A Method of Religious Awakening, she greets her readers this way. Perhaps I should first introduce myself to you. I am a Zen Buddhist and have been one for over 25 years. So I speak from within Zen, not as one who observes it from the outside, like an anthropologist might. Back to Ruth, the study of early Buddhism, into which I soon plunged, brought me to the conclusion that the pivot of that religion was awakening and the Buddhist life, a life lived in accordance with awakening. So Ruth was born in Chicago to a very affluent family, and she was brilliant. She was a master of several languages, a concert pianist. As a student at the University of Chicago, she studied yoga and Eastern religions and Sanskrit. And she married a well-to-do trial attorney who was 20 years older than herself and had a daughter. And, this is all back in 1930. So Ruth was on vacation with her family, and she happened to meet D.T. Suzuki, who is like major in bringing Zen to the West. And he gave her basic instruction. She was immediately hooked. And even when she came back to the US, she continued to practice and study with Suzuki. And in 1932, she returned to Japan for an extended stay. And she studied with Nanshin Roshi at a Rinzai temple in Kyoto. Nanshinken Roshi was a really tough Rinzai bird. This guy it wasn't like he was, trying to meet some tourist. He was a real strict Rinzai Zen Buddhist guy. And Ruth really had to prove herself. He wasn't cutting her any slack. So at first, she could not sit with the rest of the monks. She had to sit in his small private temple. But she sat strong 6 days a week and showed her rigor in the practice until Nanshinken finally trusted her and gave her her first koan, which is a major step in Rinzai. She had her first koan. In Rinzai, koan study is very essential. We're lucky in that we have the practice too, but we have both zazen and koans. Rinzai is more focused on the koan. So, she's progressed to the point where Roshi allowed her to sit in the regular Zendo with the rest of the monks, who at first, from what I've read, weren't too happy to be joined by a woman. Don't forget, she's the only woman there, and a foreigner. But they soon welcomed her presence because she was such a strong practitioner, and they appreciated sitting with her. And she went through this grueling practice, and years later, she would look back at this time and say, this was the best time of her life, this vigor that she encountered at the temple. So in 1938, when she finally gets back to the US, she began practicing with a group that would become, in New York City, that would become the first Zen Institute of America. And it was led by this character, very interesting priest by the name of Soto Sasaki. And he was a carver, a wood carver. And what he did to pay the rent was he carved images of the Buddha, and he repaired antiques for Tiffany's. But he was also a scholar of Zen Buddhism. And his students were totally devoted to him. Now, these are mostly Western students in New York City. And he was described this way by a Korean Zen master. Sokean has a good understanding of Western culture. And this, combined with his enlightened perspective, is a trustworthy bridge from Zen in the East to Zen in the West. He finds that place where East and West no longer exist, and articulates this wisdom brilliantly for all beings. I love this, this place where East and West starts to drop away. and we're just right here with each other. So Ruth was taken by this, and she not only began studying with Sokean, but she became an integral member of the first Zen Buddhist Society of America, first Zen Institute of America. She's affluent, right? So she bought, renovated the building. She's on one floor, Sokean is on another, and the Zen Institute's on the ground floor. So she kind of works on creating this temple for the first Zen Institute. But remember, this is the late 30s, and not long after World War II begins. Japanese bomb Pearl Harbor, and all of a sudden, Japanese Americans were unjustly labeled the enemy. People here, citizens, had become the enemy. And that meant that Sokean was arrested and sent to an internment camp. And of course, she spent a good deal of time trying to get him out. And once her husband died her first husband died in 1944, she married him, Sokean, to help bring him out of the internment camp. But by that time, his health had really failed. He had high blood pressure, he had had several strokes. And his health, by 1945, he was failing and he died. But I think it's notable to say that Ruth never cut off this connection with her Japanese practice all through the war, when they were changing the name of hamburgers to different things. Frankfurters became hot dogs because we were at war, and these people were such an enemy that we were trying to cut off and block away all mention. But Ruth continued to be committed to her practice with Zen Buddhists in Japan. And after the war, she went back to Kyoto in 1949. And she stayed in Kyoto for most of the rest of her life. She was the first foreigner and woman to open a Rinzai temple, Ryosenan. She was ordained as a Zen priest, and although she was careful to say that she wasn't in her temple, Ryosenan, that she wasn't performing all of the duties. She said it was because she was untrained in temple procedures, and because, she says, I needed the years left me to carry on the work of spreading Zen to the West. And as priest of Ryosenan, this was her expression, to bring Zen to the West. So very much still, she was carrying on the mission, the expression of her late partner. They were still carrying Zen to the West. And I might add, she was carrying the West to the East too. And she had her impact because she hired people like Gary Snyder and all of these people who are becoming experts in translation to help her translate the classics. And she wrote a number of books that were published by the first Zen Institute. And basically it was explaining Zen practice to the West. And in '65, she published Zen Dust, the first complete translation of Zen koans in the US. And she was a force of nature by all who met her. That's how they described her, a complete force of nature. And even in her later years, as her health started to fail, she was still pushing. She was traveling to Europe trying to find a publisher that she would be happy with to publish her remaining translations. And she finally collapsed while she was in Europe. And she went back to her temple in Japan, where she died of a heart attack in 1967. So I want to credit Isabel Sterling, who wrote this important biography, that much of it that I'm drawing from in this talk. It's called Zen Pioneer, The Life and Works of Ruth Fuller Sasaki. If you want to learn more about her, it's a really interesting book, and the great thing about it, too, is it includes her writings in the appendix. So if you want to read directly what she wrote about Zen, it's in there. And the intro to this book by Gary Snyder gives us a more intimate look, because Snyder worked with her, he really knew her, and he describes her as thus. He says, she was imperious. She grew up directing servants. Was she perfect? No. She had her falling outs and bridging moments, but look at the expression of her life. The temples, the texts, being part of a small at first, a small force that brought Zen practice to the West. So, yeah, she was imperious, but so were all of these wealthy Chinese and Japanese men who came to study Zen. So many of them came from affluent families, they had education, and that's why they could study and become teachers. So I don't consider that a flaw. And because like the men before her, her affluence helped her transcend the boundaries and allowed her resources to bring the teachings to a wider audience. And she found herself in that very special area, like her partner Sokean, where East and West start to dissolve. And we can be in the presence of the teachings. And I do remain impressed by her insistence of always remaining authentic to herself. Okay, it's not easy. She's in this foreign place. She's bathed in a different culture. She wore robes. She never shaved her head. She wore pearl earrings all of the time. But she led a traditional temple. There was discipline. There was the form. And a few nights a week after sitting, she would have people over to her home and have a Western style meal for them. And before they sat down to dinner, they would have a few rounds of martinis. So, she's not just, it's the West and East in conversation with each other. And I think that's what was so precious about her offerings. And that's why I'm inspired by her. And her, this really unique expression that she made in collaboration across cultures. And here we are still engaging with this today in subtle ways, mysterious ways. Her practice is still here. And this sort of circles back to what Dogen was saying in Dotoku, that our path is expressing our true selves. It's not done by somebody else's recipe. It's made in concert with Buddha ancestors. It's our authentic self, if you will, expressed on the canvas of Buddha Dharma. And Dogen still beckons us to investigate and make thorough inquiries of our Buddha ancestors. whoever they may be, wherever they may sit. We're in conversation with them, whether they speak or not. And I think it's part of our great mission to find out how we can listen.